Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. Storytellers have always loved to build tension by getting their characters into increasingly impossible situations, removing their options one by one until the listener is convinced that there is no possible way out. And then, suddenly, salvation comes from the least expected place, and all is well until the next crisis. The people of Israel had been brutalised and demoralised as slaves in Egypt. Then, in the process of escaping from Egypt, they are tracked down by the Egyptian army and find themselves trapped between an unassailable fighting force and a body of deep water. Now, Australians are a bit of an anomaly historically in that almost all of us can swim and love being in or near the water. We consider swimming a basic life skill. We make sure our kids learn to read and write, use the toilet, and swim 50 metres. But that is not the case for most people in history or throughout the world. It's much more common for people to be afraid of deep water. In the ancient world, water symbolised chaos, and the monsters that lurk in the deep symbolised all that was opposed to order and human flourishing. So the Israelites found themselves trapped between the most frightening fighting force that humans could produce and the most frightening element of the natural world. We often hear about thin spaces in spiritual discussions, spaces where the veil between earth and heaven seems to be particularly thin, as though we could almost reach out and touch God. That sounds lovely, but in my experience, thin spaces are often places that we would never choose to enter, places where everything that has helped us feel safe in the past is removed, and we are squashed between unthinkable options. The children of Israel were in a thin space, and they found God there. God made a way for them out of an impossible situation. It seems to me that we find ourselves in just such a thin space today, not just as one community, but as the human race collectively. On the one side is human power and violence, insistence on maintaining and improving expensive lifestyles, irresponsible overuse of natural resources. And on the other side, the natural world, like a wounded animal, is becoming more and more chaotic, more and more frighteningly extreme, so that our children and grandchildren wonder if they will have a future at all, let alone a happy one. We stand in a thin space. Will we find God here? This is a real and troubling question for Christians who are committed to making a difference in this space. Far too often, people who are passionate about healing our environment feel dismissed in their churches by people who think they should just be quiet and trust God more. Then those same people outside of church hear from their non-church-going environmentalist friends that the church is largely to blame for environmental destruction and therefore cannot be part of the solution. So they find themselves in a thin space, not fitting in anywhere. How are we, as followers of Jesus, to stand in that space? This is too big a question for us to answer in the next few minutes, but I do encourage you to keep it at the back of your mind, to meditate on it, to pray. Last week we made a start on answering this question. We saw that a Christian approach to environmental concern will acknowledge conflict and will ensure that nobody is excluded or left behind because they hold a contrary opinion. That message is reinforced by today's reading from Romans, which I won't talk about, but I do encourage you to read carefully. This week, we notice that the Israelites at the Red Sea are called to faith and action. They needed to believe that God could rescue them, and they needed to put one foot in front of another on the path that God laid out for them. Faith and action. That must be another distinctive element of a Christian response to our environmental crisis. And we can add another insight from today's gospel. As we read the parable in the NRSV, as we do here, the amounts of those debts probably didn't mean much to you because of the ancient currencies that they were in. But if we did try and do a rough translation, a rough currency exchange, and we can only do a rough one, but we find that the first slave owed about $4 billion in our terms. Now, I very much doubt that anyone I know has ever had in their hands that amount of money, let alone been in a position to get into debt for that amount. And if I'm wrong about that, then I'd love to have a conversation with you about some work we need to do around the church. So the idea in this parable is that this slave owes an astronomical amount of money. How could a slave possibly accumulate that sort of debt, especially in a day where there were no credit cards? Well, slavery in the Roman world was a bit different from what went on in the 17th century. Slaves could be found across a whole range of occupations, including the highest levels of business management. A slave in that world might build up that sort of obligation if the king had entrusted him with a very, very significant business venture or a military campaign that had gone horribly wrong. Exactly how the money was lost is not important to the story. The important thing is that the king had placed a huge amount of trust in this slave, had invested in him enormously, and that investment had gone wrong. The king had lost his money. It's hard, I think, for us to identify with that slave and so feel the full force of the punchline because most of us can't even imagine being entrusted with that sort of money, let alone losing it. But what if we stop being so individualistic? What if we identify the whole human race with the slave in that story? According to Genesis 1 and 2, we have collectively been entrusted with the greatest of all responsibilities, to be caretakers and co-creators as God's image in the world, to form a community that shows the rest of the created order what God looks like, and to care for God's beautiful, good creation in God's name. God invested hugely in us. God literally gave us the world. And what have we done with that investment? I'm not going to say we've done nothing good. Of course, we've done some good things, but we have also devised more and more effective ways of destroying each other and our environment. We have exploited our world's resources to the point where our planet is badly damaged, and many, many creatures in our care have become extinct before their time. And now we find ourselves unable to make good on those losses. Our business is in a downward spiral that we cannot reverse. We are in a thin space, like the slave in the parable, like the people of Israel at the Red Sea. From here, we can almost reach out our hand and touch God. In fact, if we lived 1900 years ago, we could have done just that. In Jesus, God entered the human predicament and began the work of restoration. Jesus' resurrection initiated a new creation, which, when brought to fruition, will not only repair the damage we've done, but will bring all creation to its fulfillment. Our collective human failure has been redeemed and is being redeemed by our fellow human being, Jesus Christ, who calls us to work with him. But that sort of forgiveness, that sort of grace, leads to a fork in the road. The correct path is signposted by the sort of radical gratitude we find in the story you might remember from the Gospel of Luke, of the forgiven woman who washed Jesus' feet with her tears and dried them with her hair and anointed him with perfume. Completely inappropriate, over the top, joyful devotion. If we take that path, then any action we take to care for creation will be an act of love and devotion toward our Creator. Every plastic bag we refuse, every light switch we turn off, and every time we walk or ride instead of driving will be an expression of love and gratitude to God. But the forgiven slave in this story shows that there is a less joyful path we could take. Being forgiven a huge debt can be uncomfortable because we don't like admitting our own bankruptcy. It can be humiliating. Now, humiliation can teach us humility if we let it. But if we are not humbled by it, then we may try to prove our worth by putting others down. We may get angry. We may get violent, as the forgiven slave did in the story when he encountered someone who owed him a much, much, much smaller amount of money. This parable warns us not to take that path, but to be honest about what we have done. Honest about the plastics in our oceans. Honest about the melting polar ice caps. Honest about the extinctions that we have overseen in Australia. Let's not approach the throne of God and pretend we can pay it back if we are just given a little bit more time. We can't. All we can do is ask for mercy, receive forgiveness, and then go from there with humility and take joy in being God's co-workers in caring for God's wounded creation. So this week, may God provide a way for you and empower you with humility to act in faith and joy for the healing of creation. Amen.